Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman podcast.
The bottom line is, the great thing about consultancy is people always have challenges. They always have issues. And if you've got some way of helping them resolve those issues, there's a solution that somebody will buy.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Hi, I'm Richard Newton. I'm a professional author and a management consultant. I've written a number of books and I consulted all around the world for a few decades now. If you want to find out more about me, the best place is look at my profile on LinkedIn. I have a page on Amazon, a sales page for my books, and you can look at my company website, which is inixus.co.uk.
On this episode of the show with Richard, well, we've all been told that we should be consultative selling. In this episode, Richard's explaining what a consultant actually is from the perspective of a professional consultant, what value they bring to the table, how they sell and close deals, and how they account manage after the fact. There's a ton of value in this episode, so let's jump right into it. For decades now, even I got in sales probably about 10 years ago, we've been told, sales professionals, that we should sell like a consultant. We should consultative sell. We should act and behave like a consultant. And I want to dive into if that's really possible when all we're trying to do is drive revenue and perhaps add a bit of value up front. I want to dive into if that's possible, and then kind of your thoughts on how you would go about adding value to a client kind of further down the line in the interview itself. So with that, Richard, do you have a definition of what, or a kind of to paint a picture of what a consultant actually is?
Yeah, I do, and I'll paint that picture. One of the things I would say is I don't actually think all consultants do what I think of as consultative sales. So we'll kind of talk about both those. But to me, a consultant is somebody with some expertise which they are selling to clients, essentially to provide advice. It's a service-based sale. It's a complex service, and I think the interesting characteristic about it is the client doesn't actually know what they've bought until the work is finished. So it's kind of a bit of a trust-based kind of product that people are buying.
And on that, again, just to continue painting this picture just for a second, why, and this is a seemingly simple question, but there might be somewhat of a profound answer to it. Why do people need a consultant and expertise? What, other than the obvious, kind of what value can that add?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think that's changed over time. So if you went back historically, people needed consultants because there were points of expertise which it wasn't worth an organization employing full time, but they needed those expertise on for a particular instance. I think as we've gone forward, organizations have become leaner and thinner, and they have fewer of their own teams. And so there's just stuff they haven't got enough resources to do. And consultancies have expertise in certain areas, and so people come out for help. The bottom line is, the great thing about consultancy is people always have challenges. They always have issues. And if you've got some way of helping them resolve those issues, there's a solution that somebody will buy.
And we'll come back. I feel like I'm 3 questions in and we're going to go down a rabbit hole and sidetrack already. But with the world of B2B sales, it was kind of shook up, and I think in the best way possible with the onset of the internet, right? It used to be that salespeople were the gatekeepers to catalogs and information, and you had to, if you wanted to buy any product, you had to engage with 2 free sales professionals to get just a tender or a series of quotations in place. Now, the internet, the information's out there, it's free. Salespeople are now engaging later on in the sales cycle and kind of changed sales forever, and it's got rid of a whole bunch of terrible salespeople from kind of the bottom rungs of the industry. How has the internet changed perhaps consulting with, not just books being out there, more people writing more and more books about more and more topics that are available for essentially almost free, kind of $5, $10, $20 a pop. But how is just the internet, and essentially you can Google pretty much anything, right, that you would want to find. How does that change the consulting industry, if at all?
Well, I think what has changed, you're absolutely right, is that knowing stuff is no longer a useful skill, because I can do a search on the internet and know it. But knowing how to put stuff into practice is still really a differentiator. And, I write books. I don't hold any secrets. I put what I know into them. I still think even if someone reads those books, there's things I can probably do better than 95% of people, because the practical application of knowledge is still something you can't just encapsulate in a blog article or a page on the internet or even a book. It's kind of experience, and there's those sort of, I'm not sure what the expression is, but there's those those things that you can't, that they're difficult to grasp, but they are the things that make you practical and able to apply things. And we all know people, great academic may know loads, but you wouldn't necessarily hire them to get stuff done in your business. And so I think the emphasis is increasingly on value through not telling me stuff, but showing me how to get it done and helping me to get it done.
Okay, so I want to dive into specifically that in a second of, again, how we compete against a Google search and kind of get things implemented. But before that, as a consultant, and this is part of the consultative selling process, right, that salespeople are taught, we go in, we find the problems, we perhaps give some ideas or examples of how to solve problems, how other people have solved them, and hopefully it relates back to our product, they make a sale, and then if we get into account management, we kind of look after the account over time. But with that said, how would someone like yourself, professional at all of this, how do you uncover problems that people have and, so you can align yourself to potentially solve them?
So, I mean, the fundamental thing is for me is when I meet a client, let's say a new client for the first time, my mind is I try not to be focused on selling them anything. My view of a good interaction is, have I learned something about that client and have I deepened my relationship? And I know that sounds a bit trite, but the truth is, if you focus on building trust and relationships, the sales naturally come over time. Yeah. So it is a bit about thinking about the long game, not about the transaction of today. And as you build trust with people, and somehow we a skill which, if we were down the pub with our mates, we have no problem building trust, but we kind of leave that skill at the door when we go to work for a reason I don't understand. But if you apply the same sort of skills with your customers and you build that trust, they will open up and tell you stuff. And it's not always the obvious things that are their real problems. I mean, somebody has to have a degree of trust to tell you what's the real challenges they're facing. And the more trust you have, the more times a client will treat you as the person who's going to help them. I mean, for me, the aim of every interaction is get to the point where you have that what people generally call that trusted advisor status. What does that mean in practice? What it means in practice is when a client is there and has a problem, they actually pick up the phone and think, who shall I talk to? Oh, I'll talk to Mary, or I'll talk to Fred, or I'll talk to Richard, because that's someone I know I can trust and I can talk it through with them. They're not going to try and sell me stuff, but we may well get to a point which the answer is, what's going to help you is you need some of my time. So it is about that kind of long-term relationship building and developing trust. And there are, specific techniques you can use to develop trust, but the reality is the simple thing is just being honest and open with them.
So I want to come into the learning element of this in a second, but the trust element is something that we shouldn't just gloss over. Now, I don't have a framework, I don't have a technique, I don't have any way of doing this, but my experience in medical device sales was that I worked for one of the biggest companies in the endoscopic space, endoscopy space, and then I moved to the other biggest company in the endoscopy space. So I knew both their products, I knew the surgeons on both sides of the table, whether they were committed to one series of products or the other. And so people would call me up, exactly how you described in there, Richard, of we've got problems with supplier A's equipment. Can you solve it with supplier B's? Or we've got problem with supplier B's. We're thinking about supplier A. Perhaps you could just give us a bit of insight or thought on that as well. And I would regularly do inadvertently. This is, clearly wasn't planned. It was just me being a complete nerd with the equipment and really enjoying playing around with it. I knew it all inside out, and I could help and I could debug and I could solve problems on that front. And it led to what you described, which is amazing, which is the best for salespeople, right? People called me, I would go in, stuff would get sold, and it wasn't icky, it wasn't weird. I didn't have to kind of cold call people or anything like that. So with all that said, and that kind of example laid out for the audience there, Richard, is there a framework? Is there some way of building trust? Is there a structure to how we should schedule our meetings out perhaps over a month or 2 months as we're doing this discovery, as we're learning about a potential business, or maybe it isn't 2 months, maybe it's 2 phone calls if you're skilled at the process. Is there a way to build trust that is more? Is there a way to go about it more so than just spend more time with the individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are specific techniques in building trust. And actually, it's not one of my books. There is a great book out there called The Trusted Advisor, which I really would recommend anybody who's interested in that field to read. And it's got some absolutely solid techniques on how to do it. without spending a huge amount of time talking about it, I mean, the fundamental thing to me about trust is actually really listening to a client. And, I know that a lot of people say they listen, but when most of us listen, when we listen to people, when we're in that kind of sales mode, what we're listening for is the opportunity to introduce our product or our service. I think when you really listen, you're actually in a different state. You're trying to understand that person's mindset and trying to think how you can help them. And the if you like, the sales hook comes secondarily to that. So it's that being authentic and open. And there really is a difference between someone who is actually listening and somebody who is listening just for the opportunity to when I can make my pitch. And we are, as human beings, we are remarkably astute at knowing the difference between them. I don't really understand how the brain works in that respect, but we all know when we're in one situation and the other. I mean, the other thing I would say about consultancy is different from, say, a product-based sales because it is inherently a service, and therefore there's always an element of course, you're being compared to other services, but when I buy something, I may have a brand, I may come from one of the big consultancies, and that brand really may help. But fundamentally, what you're buying is the person in front of you or the people they're going to bring in. So no amount of branding or anything else changes the fact that it is the individuals who are going to do that work. So it becomes about the individual relationship. And I think one of the things that people talk about is, for example, they'll say, I have a relationship with firm X, or firm X has a relationship with me. I always think that's kind of nonsense. Firms don't have relationships. You don't have relationships with a firm. You may have an opinion about a firm, but that's a different thing. You have a relationship with people. It's always about individuals to individuals and that relationship there. And sometimes that gets kind of lost, and people worry too much about that. What's the relationship with my firm? It's always about the individual you're talking with and about yourself as an individual and building up that relationship. Does that help?
That makes total sense, yeah. and just on to kind of wrap up the relationship piece.
Yeah.
Clearly, the more that we can learn about an individual, an organization, their goals, and how that aligns with perhaps your experience, the easier it all becomes, right? You can have as you described earlier, if you go for a pint with your mates and they introduce someone new, if you can find immediately or as quick as possible that moment of commonality, that point of commonality, everything clicks and you go, oh, they're part of the group, right? How, or do you ask any specific questions, or are there any unusual or interesting questions you would ask other than the cliches of what keeps you up at night and stuff like that, which everyone kind of is yawning as I say that question out loud? Are there any interesting questions that you ask, Richard?
I don't think I have any off-pat questions. I mean, I think there is an element of going kind of with the flow in terms of the situation. Of course, there's no, when somebody talks to you as what are you here to talk about? What I think what keeping you awake at night is kind of an okay introduction. I don't want to be too disingenuous with this and say that all I'm there to is to talk to them and understand their problems. I mean, I'm not a coach, and of course I do need to make a sale. So rather than talk about the questions, let me talk about the process I use to get to that point, which is, there is an element of, I mean, I think of the sales process in consultancy for me as kind of 3 steps. And those 3 steps are finding clients. And, that's and just having that opportunity to talk. Then there's that point about talking, but at some point you need to focus down that conversation. And that's where the question's becoming important. And the challenge in focusing down an opportunity is doing it in such a way that the questions you're asking are getting you to a point where you can frame a specific opportunity. So my final stage is in framing, but they can't be, you can't go in there with a predetermined mindset where it's going to get there. Otherwise, you'll make a mistake. And what happens often in consultancy is you can lead a client by a set of questions, and they'll get to a point where they actually will say, yeah, that's what I want. And you start some work, and then you find out very quickly that's not what they want. And the problem then is you may be on the ground, but you may have sold a completely missized piece of work that is not profitable for you, is not satisfactory for the client. So the process of questioning needs to be very, very, what's traditionally called open questions. So not questions which have a predetermined answers, but questions in which you are really letting the customer get to. Once you've got that nugget, then you need to hone in on the specific questions to frame it down into, okay, so I understand this is your problem. and then actually let's get into the specific characteristics of this.
How does this change, and to shift gears slightly here, after the prospecting process? Perhaps they brought you on. I don't really know how consultancy works on a kind of a fee basis. Maybe it's a retainer, whatever it is. So you're working with them. How does the questioning process change, if at all, at that point? So for what I'm getting at here, from our perspective, is perhaps we're account managing at this point. They've got the product. We want to continue to build that relationship with them. How do we ask them questions to kind of deepen things?
Okay, so let me answer a couple of questions. I mean, consultancy generally works in one of two ways. It's either a day rate type basis, or it's a price for a piece of work. So sure. You'll say, well, I think this will take us 3 months, so I will charge you X for this, and at the end of X, you will have whatever it is. It might be as simple as a report, or it may actually be some work you've done with the team or whatever. So the actual output varies. So once you have landed on a client, whether it's you yourself landing or it's somebody, because consultant, you may not be the person doing the consultant, you may have sold somebody else to actually do the work, then it does change, because in that initial phase, it is very much about framing down to a proposition. Once you're doing the work, it is much more, now I'm the expert here. This is the sort of stuff I need to know for enable me to help you solve your problems. So that does become much more directive questioning. But the interesting thing about consultancy is almost never when you've sold the deal are you actually sure that is exactly what the client wants. And the reality is, it's not until you get in working with a client, and because that client in an organization, there'll be other players involved, that you have to kind of, you're fleshing out what's needed as you go along. And that's one of the biggest challenges in consultancy is I've sold them a promise, but the reality is I don't really know all the characteristics of this promise until I'm there. And I certainly don't know if that's exactly the right promise they want. So there has to be a degree of flexibility in consultancy to sort of bend as you go through the work and delivery. So that's always an interesting challenge as you go through a consulting engagement.
I think B2B sales, especially at the kind of high deal sizes, is moving more and more towards that with software as a service.
Absolutely.
Kind of the people are now, I won't perhaps name companies in case it's been told to me in confidence. And I forgot that I've been told in confidence because I have so many of these conversations, but a lot of brands, especially the Silicon Valley brands that we work with here on the show, are moving towards commissions for bringing someone on board, but then heavy commissions quarter on quarter for retaining people, organizations. So it seems like it's not totally dissimilar in certain areas of sales. So with that said, Richard, how do you then manage this mess of politics within an account kind of after the deal's been done, that manage the kind of decision makers and people pulling one way, and then 5 weeks in you realize that someone's leaving the organization and someone has different priorities? How do you physically manage this? Do you use project management software, or is there any tools, or is it kind of written down? How do you go about all that?
Okay, so it's a very complicated question with lots of answers, but let me try and unpick it and sort of answer that layer by layer. Yeah. So actually, in terms of managing an engagement, personally, I always plan it out. And I have a background from years ago as a project manager. So that bit is relatively easy and structured for me. I plan it out, always in the mindset, though, the plan is just a sense of direction. It's never going to quite end up like that. So there has to be a degree of flex and capacity in that plan to move. In terms of the work, you need to think in terms of, I think, 2 streams of work. And there is the work that's actually doing the stuff the client wants you to do, whether it is a piece of analysis, whether it's a strategic review, or in my case, helping clients plan through how they're going to make changes and improve their organization. That's the sort of work I'm typically doing. But in parallel with that, that's kind of what would, it's a word I don't like, but people would typically call a governance stream. And this is where you're managing the relationship with the client as we're going along. And that is an ingoing interaction, which is kind of saying, this is how the work's going. It's going faster or slower than we expect. Is this what you're expecting? And in parallel with that, is your mind changing as we're going to go through that? And how do we deal with that change of mind? And this is where trust becomes absolutely crucial. And the reason trust becomes crucial is if you get halfway through a piece of work which you have given a fixed price for, and you find that the client's expectation of it are completely different from yours, then where you have a trust-based relationship, when you go back to the client and say, Do you know what? I've learned quite a lot as I've been here, and what I've learned is what we have originally scoped is not what we are going to do, what you need, and therefore we need to change it. And maybe that's got a different price tag to it. The client is much more open to that dialogue than if you're a bit of a stranger or maybe a point expert. The client's going to go, "No, you're ripping me off. I just want you to do it for the price we've already agreed." So it's that thing. So think in terms of the management of the process. And ironically, your point about to your project manager, a lot of consultants are absolutely awful at managing their engagements. And there's that classic thing on a consultant engagement, which say, let's say it's a 6-month piece of work where it sort of pods along at a pace, and then the last 2 weeks are complete madness getting everything finished. And yet we knew 6 months ago it was going to be like that. But that's why I wrote a book on consultancy, because one of the things I find irritating about a lot of consultants, they do that. But so there's that management process, there's the delivery, and then there is the managing of the relationship as you go along. So a consultant is kind of always in two spaces, doing the work, managing the relationship, and they're interwoven, but they have to be both remembered.
Okay, so we'll come back on and we'll perhaps wrap up the show with project management in a second. Yeah. I very literally, it's funny, and this is a timely conversation, because I'll get some thoughts on you on books, resources for that. I've literally just bought Project Management for Dummies, because I'm doing a lot of, or not me personally, I'm managing a team that's doing a lot of software development at the moment for the sales school, and I have no idea what I'm doing with regards to kind of managing, hiring, keeping track of everything that's going on and people's different projects kind of interlined to each other. So we'll touch on that in a second. But one thing you said here, which I think is really important and perhaps is the easiest way to keep people on a kind of a software as a service product if it's valuable for them, and that is to check in with them and to see regularly whether they're getting, I think you used the word, or essentially the sentence of getting the value that they expected from the initial conversation. Should this be done quarterly? Is this a conversation? Is this something that should be documented? So if there's a complaint, you can show them what they said originally. How do we go about keeping track of all this?
Okay, so if you took software as a service as an example, now, I mean, I'm a consultant, not a software as a service sales, but actually, ironically, a lot of my work is with clients implementing software as a service. I don't think there's a fixed answer to that. I think there's a steady drumbeat once we're there and the software's working, we're all ready. I think up front, when it first happens, I think there needs to be a very tight interaction with the customer. And the reason for that is twofold. When you buy something like software as a service, it is a little bit like consultancy in the sense there's a promise, but it's only when the client starts using it that you know a couple of things. One is, does actually the product really match my needs, which is kind of the area where a client might get dissatisfied. But there's the other from the suppliers, the software as a service providers, is the client kind of using this in the way we anticipate them using it? Because, software as a service providers really want you all to be working ideally in a pretty similar way, because that's how they can sell a vanilla product, which is for, all customers can use. But you find out the customers aren't. And there's those initial few months, which if you're not really on top of your customer, there's a real danger that you'll get a level of dissatisfaction. I think once you're past that and you're then into whatever the product is, it's embedded into the process and operations. Yes, there needs to be a regular drumbeat, because of course there's always an opportunity that there might be additional modules, and there's always that upgrade paths and new versions that need to be implemented. So it depends on the product, whether it's monthly or quarterly. It depends how core it is to the operations. Is it your end-to-end ERP system, or is it a point system used in a particular department? But I think the critical point is, it's not that the lifetime use of that is there's a consistent relationship throughout it that needs a consistent process. It needs different styles of interaction, I think, at different points.
So get on top of them at first, make sure it's doing what we promised, and then we can kind of teeter off towards, well, not teeter off, that's the wrong way of describing it, but reduce the cadence, I guess, as it gets embedded.
Yeah, and I think what you don't want to be is, the advantage that software providers often have is that software becomes embedded into an organization, and actually you can get to the point where kind of they need you more than you need them, which is a good thing for a supplier because it gives lock-in, but it's a bad thing because it's in danger of getting that relationship where you get a bit arrogant about it. And I don't think what you want to be is one of those suppliers who, and we've all seen it, who the firm is going, well, they sold us X, but God, what is this stuff that's delivered? Because it certainly isn't X. You want to be one of those suppliers who they say, they sold us X, and wow, this is 2X. Because even because I think longer term, that's what drives your success. And I think if you look at the great software as a service providers, and I'm not an expert, for example, in Salesforce, but so many. If you go and talk to salespeople, they want Salesforce. They don't want the other CRM packages. They want Salesforce because they know it and it's fitted their needs. And that's the kind of relationship you want with a client.
That makes total sense. Okay, I'll give some kind of an example for this, and we'll keep essentially software as a service or a monthly payment, but I'll put it back to hardware for anyone who's selling kind of physical products. So I was selling to the NHS here in the UK, endoscopy products, and they wouldn't want to have a huge capital outlay of millions. Perhaps they wanted a service contract where we own the equipment, but they essentially used it. We would cover all the repairs. And a couple of NHS trusts in the UK, when I left anyway, had set up these massive service agreements. So this works for not just software, which is, I guess, we talk about it probably far too often on the show because it's top of mind with the brands that I work with, but it also works for physical products as well. And I found that you get it all installed, it'd all be going great, and there would always be one person within the account. It was either the IT department, because they thought that they weren't as involved as what they should have been with the camera systems and everything being installed in the first place. And that was a problem on the salesperson's kind of front, the salesperson's perspective. They should have spent more time with the IT department. The other people who were always a pain in the ass were bioelectrical engineering. Essentially, they maintained and monitored all the physical hardware within NHS trusts here in the UK and hospitals kind of like worldwide. Now, they were important, Richard, to us, and they were important for the account to have a long-term standing relationship, because if a piece of equipment went down, it went to either one of these departments, they would call you. If they didn't like you, they wouldn't call you for a week, and then you'd be getting phone calls from a surgeon saying, why haven't you been in? And it caused friction on multiple fronts. But for whatever reason, whether it's our fault in the first place for not spending enough time with them, not getting them involved in the purchase from the kind of the offset, whatever it was, they were always a pain in the ass to deal with. Literally 9 times out of 10. With that said, and we're talking about relationships here, we're talking about building trust, talking about adding value. How do we get these individuals that are perhaps in a specific industry like mine, were always a bit of a pain to deal with? How do we get these individuals to open up to us? How do we get them to come on our side? Is there any intelligent questions we should ask them? Should we be inviting them to meetings? What would be the strategy to deal with these individuals?
Okay, so I think the health service is notoriously a very complex environment to work in, and it's complex for the particular reasons you've just mentioned. It has a very complex set of stakeholders, and unlike a normal organization, which, for example, kind of all funnels up to a chief exec, in health service, you have different, if you like, power bases who all have different opinions. But I think it is, if you like, at the complex end, but it reflects a model that's always true, which is organizations and the trite answer to you is you need to do a bit more work.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds trite, but we have to be realistic about the amount of work we need to do, because very rarely in an organization is there a decision maker who can make a decision that everybody else is just going to accept and go along toe in with. Normally there is a complex map of stakeholders. So the first thing I think that's really important to is understand who are the client, or who is the client in this situation. And that is a remarkably complex question to answer in a lot of situations. And who are the key stakeholders? Now, we can't, on one hand, we cannot literally try and get everybody on board that might have a bad or good thing to say about us. So we just have to have a realistic view that in a very complex environment, there's always going to be somebody who's going to come up at the last minute and say, I don't like what you're doing. That's just life. On the other hand, we can't, though, take the simplistic view, which says person X has got a budget and they've agreed to buy this, so the only person I need to talk to is person X. Life just isn't that simple. There are other critical stakeholders who will who will make a judgment on whether you're successful or not. So it's not that there's a specific set of questions I think to answer. It is that the first point is getting our head clear around who are the other stakeholders. And I think if I've been invited in by someone, I'm talking, we're getting to a problem, one of the questions I'm going to start asking them relatively early on is, okay, who else is important in this process? Who else has an influence on the success of this? Who else is going to judge whether this is successful or not? Who else has an influence on the requirements for going through this? Can you actually spend that money yourself, or do you need to get some other people on board? And so for me, governance processes are not simply about interacting with a person. They're normally about interacting with a number of people. And this is something that we really need to take into account early on, because if the stakeholder set is really complicated, that means it's a lot of work. And if it's a lot of work, it means it may damage the profitability of your sale. So we have to take into account when we're judging a sale up front is the stakeholders map so complicated that I can never possibly take a profit on this because I'm going to be having to spend so much time managing them? Or is there a way I can reflect in my pricing the complexity of that stakeholders? Now, if you've actually should have alignment with your client here, though, because if your client wants you to do a job and the client wants that job to be successful, again, and it goes back to that trusting relationship, part of the discussion is, okay, to make this successful, we're going to have to take these 5 other people with us or these 10 other people with us. Yeah. Well, that's actually work. And, that's going to add about another 15 or 20% overhead on my piece of work. Now, obviously, I'm normally selling services. I'm talking about day rates, so you can do that. How you reflect that in pricing into physical products, I don't know. But I think it does absolutely need to be reflected in both the pricing mechanisms and in those critical decisions of, is this a client we really want? Because there are some situations where the stakeholders are so complex and so antagonistic, but not really willing to put the investment in coming together, that actually sometimes you have to think about those clients as, you know what, that's not really a client I think I want to deal with, because it's just going to be too much overhead. I'm not trying to focus on the negative, but we always have to have that as a backstop there.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. And this is exactly what I wanted out of this conversation, Richard. Of that's higher level thinking than perhaps what even the average successful B2B sales professional is thinking about. 99% of the time, they're thinking, get in there, add value, get the deal done, and then see ya. And then it goes off to hopefully customer success, or there's account manager, or people come after the fact. But as an organization to have success, perhaps these are conversations that we should be having, especially if we're doing, account-based selling. Perhaps we're trying to sell to Salesforce or some kind of beast organization like that. Perhaps it isn't as simple as just get in, get out, and pass on the book to someone else, especially if we want to close more deals off the back of it, right? If we want this to, even if we are just commissioned up front, even if you want to sell to, like me selling to hospitals, I'd go in, I'd sell to urology. Pretty much all urologists used one of the brands that I've worked for, because they're all trained on that equipment, even though it's very similar to elsewhere. That was the cool brand, basically. They wanted to use that. But then I'd do well with them. I'd go into gynecology, then I'd go into general surgery, and then we were selling like flexible endoscopes at one point as well. So it's important to kind of go through all these and meet all the stakeholders and all that. And that leads us, I guess, onto the project management. And I know this is 5 episodes in its own right, Richard, so we won't go too in depth into this. But just to touch on it as it's been brought up, a lot of what we're describing here is, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but is somewhat project management. It's kind of starting out one end, knowing where we want to go, and then having a plan of action to get there, which I think salespeople don't always. Salespeople will go after the low-hanging fruits. They'll try and put out fires, and everything else in between seemingly goes out the window, because, as I said, we're driven to drive revenue. We're not incentivized, rightly or wrongly, to manage processes. So, is there just a super brief definition of or description of what project management actually is? Because I think we know on a high level concept of what it is, but from an expert in that space, how does it look?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I mean, project management is about breaking down a task with a known goal into a set of logical steps, and then working out what's the best routing to do them in. Now, there's a huge amount of complexity that can go under that, but the reality is, there's a lot of skills we're talking about in the sorts of sales we're talking about, but they're not complex like building, a spaceship to the moon or something. And so my kind of advice on this is, when you talk to people in these, they'll talk about a client, they'll go, it's a nasty client, or it's a difficult client. You go, have you ever had one like this before? And generally they'll go, yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
And so the point is, well, what did you learn last time? Well, we learned this and this. And have you applied that in this situation? Well, yeah, sort of. So I'm a great believer. So for consultancy, for engagements, there's complexity and there's lessons, but they're not super complex. So I typically use checklists. Frankly, I typically have a checklist of things like, have I thought about all these points? Am I doing them in the right order? Is this leading to the goal that I want to do? It's not rocket science, but we're not doing rocket science. And it's not like we're doing it for the first time. We're doing something that we do on a repeated basis. Of course, each situation has unique characteristics, but it's rare that you come to a situation that there is individually something which you go, my God, I've never come across anything like this ever before in my life. And so we learn from that. And so my whole point about we were talking about the complexity of stakeholder bases is, since we know they're going to be complex, let's think about that up front and think about how we're going to deal with it, not go in and assume it's not going to be complex and then go, wow, this is just like every other piece of work I've ever done. It's complex. So build that into your scope. And the other thing, which is not quite a project management thing, but is the person you are actually interacting with and selling with lives in that environment day in, day out. That is their reality. So saying to them, do you know what, this is going to be a bit more complex than I think. I think we need to do some work around this, bringing stakeholders on board. In most cases, they'll go, you know what, you're right. That's stuff that I have to deal with on a daily basis. But and you're quite right. We're going to need to think about it in this piece of work. So they're not somebody who's going to normally push back on that. They're normally somebody who goes, you're absolutely right. And that shows that you understand the environment I work in.
That's great. And I feel like if a salesperson, if you go to tender or whatever it is, and there's one salesperson with a bunch, maybe I'll ask you this a second, whether it's a physical bunch of checklists on a documented or not, or whether it's in people's heads. But suppose, say some person comes in, these are the steps we need to go through. These are the people we find that you need to have on board to make this happen. This is the kind of first week progress, and we'll check in that we've achieved these 4 or 5 things. That person is going to look incredibly professional versus the salesperson who comes in trying to be quick-witted and unplanned and try and do it all in their head on the spot. It's almost the definition of a professional, right?
Yeah. So I agree. And always the thing that always surprises me is how easy it is to do. It's not like we're trying to do something particularly clever. And so the checklists I use are physical checklists. I have them. There is some of them in my book, although they're obviously very orientated to consultancy engagements. They are physical checklists. One thing I do want to say, and everything in life for me is about balance, is we don't want to go from a structured position, though, to where the checklist becomes, if you like, the answer to everything. It isn't. It's a guide. But there'll always be times where you need to have the freedom as a professional, as an expert in your field, to say, yeah, you know what, that checklist has been a helpful aid memoir to me. But in this instance, I need to go outside of it, because you don't want to be kind of, you don't want to go from the complete freewheeler to the person who is completely wooden with the client and sitting there going, yeah, right, I've done step 1.1B, tick. I now need, because that doesn't work either. So it's having the fluidity to use that as a guide. So it's finding the balance, if you like, of the best of those extremes.
Yeah, I think honestly, that's the key takeaway from this episode, Richard. I feel having that in some kind of binded document. I think we've all got these checklists in our heads. We all know, for me, selling medical devices, I've got to go and speak to IT. I've got to go and speak to this individual. I've got to see what other surgeons, other than the big loudmouth one that's complaining about the hardware, that's getting all this kind of motivated. And as you said in the top of the show, it's very easy just to spend a lot of time with that individual, because they'll probably do most of the selling for you and they'll probably get the deal done. But then you're out of luck if you want any help from anyone else, because you've not built trust kind of during the sales process after the transaction is done. So you're just making your life harder for yourself after the fact. I think coming in with some kind of document, some kind of structure, it almost sets yourself apart in that, how to describe it? It's almost like you could go a few steps deeper than this. I know management consultant agencies have their own philosophies on things. You can start to tie in some of that if you work for a brand that's like what I have, that has been around for 100 years. They have their own way of doing things, and that isn't always well communicated. And when you do communicate that, people go, oh, these guys are the real deal, versus the quick startup that's just charging 50% of perhaps what you were charging. It's another way to differentiate yourself and to kind of validate the pricing, right? Is there anything else on that? And I guess this is what we'll wrap up with. Perhaps you do charge more because you do all of this. Perhaps your organization charges more because there's more support on the back end. You charge more for all these different reasons, all these different ways to add value. Are there any ways as a consultant you would position yourself with this knowledge, knowing that you're going into a battle and you don't want it to end up coming down to price? Is there any way you position yourself on that front?
Yes, there is. I mean, in the sense that what you're talking about is very, very, very occasionally a client wants somebody to come in with a completely blank piece of paper and do something completely and utterly innovative. That's really rare, but it happens, and it's really exciting when it happens. But most of the clients, what a client's looking for is somebody who comes in and says, do you know what? I understand your problem, and I've done it 20 times before. And the way I can show you, I mean, I'd never literally say those words, but the way I can show you that I've done it 20 times before is because I've actually got the semblance of a methodology, or I've got some kind of checklist. I'm really, really a safe pair of hands. You can trust me intimately in this. And because I'm a safe pair of hands, you just trust me on that. And actually, we can then move our relationships beyond that safe pair of hands and into trust. And I think that does directly influence on your ability to premium price. There's no doubt that consultants who go into, and let me talk from the consultant experience, can go in confidently with a client and not, yeah, I'm a good guy, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but no, actually, I'm a guy who understands your specific problem, and look, here's my expertise in it. And by the way, yeah, I am 50% more expensive, but that's because you are buying an expert. You're not just buying somebody who's going to come and have a nice chat with you. So, yeah, no, I think all those things get reflected into pricing.
And final thing on this, Richard, we talk about, in fact, quite recently, we've had a few people on to talk about storytelling in sales and sharing customer stories and this kind of thing. Is there anything you do as a consultant, whether it's testimonials or, I don't know, anything like that, that is perhaps out of the ordinary or unusual versus the obvious stuff, like being able to tell a story about the person you're speaking to's competitor, who you've already helped?
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is always really an interesting technique. I mean, as somebody who's a writer professionally as well, as a kind of my other life, I'm obviously very interested in storytelling, and it's something I try to do. And I think there's always a bit of a care there in sense of the only thing I'm going to add is it's not something particularly original, but when you're storytelling, one of the dangers in telling stories about other situations is the client finds it useful, but is also thinking, are you just going to walk out the door and tell my story to somebody else? So I think it's again back to balance, which is my favorite word, about just making sure that we don't overly sell that we're telling you all the secrets that we've sold to everyone else, and there's a bit of an art to that. Beyond that, no, I don't think I have a specific storytelling technique that I would use with clients.
And just to finish, do you get testimonials? Do you get stories? Do you document this kind of thing, or is it people? What I'm asking, Richard, you walk into a room, are people trusting in Richard? Comes in, has how many other books you have, tons of them, and they're trusting in you as an individual, or do you have extra resources on top of that, if that makes sense?
Okay, so I do have extra resources. I mean books, anybody who knows the economics of book writing would know that you don't really write books just for book sales. I love it when they sell, but actually they're predominantly and increasingly a credibility thing. I do have other resources, but the best resource of all is not a documented testimony. It's a recommendation, and it's the ability. And I always ask clients, and it's a fairly easy conversation if you have it at the right time, which says, you know what, I'm going to be selling a similar service to someone else. Ideally, they're not a direct competitor. That makes it more challenging. Would you be happy for me to give them your phone number just for a 5-minute call?
Yeah.
And a direct conversation counts for so much more than a written testimonial. Now, we've all seen documents with about 500 testimonials on it, or we've seen people with LinkedIn profiles. I spend a lot of time on my profile, but does anybody really care about those things? But actually saying to someone, if would you like to speak to your peer in another organization? He or she is happy to give me a recommendation. You can ask them some honest questions about the what it's like to work with me, and that is really the best of all.
Powerful stuff. Well, with that, Richard, I know you're not a quote unquote salesperson, but clearly you have to kind of sell your consulting, so you'll have an insight for this. And I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Not to feel that selling is anything dishonorable and that you're pushing something that people don't want. People need stuff. People need to get jobs done. It's just, you're just offering them a service. You are actually adding them value. You're not, there's no way you're kind of cheating them. And I think my younger self, and certainly my junior days in consulting, you kind of felt that sales was a little bit grubby, and that actually doing the work was the good thing. And as you get older, you realize, or as I get more experience, to be honest, I've realized that actually the reason clients talk to you is because they honestly do need help, and they like it when you do good work for them. You're doing a good thing.
That is the name of a book for sure. If it doesn't already exist,
Yeah.
People Need Stuff, kind of colon yada 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 about selling or a business. That is probably the best way to put it. For anyone who's listening to this right now, perhaps you're new to selling, perhaps you don't want to pick up the phone, you're nervous about emailing, you're knocking on doors like I did, knocking on operating theatres, and you're sticking your head in and hoping a surgeon doesn't blast your face off shouting across at you by throwing scalpels. People Need Stuff is a good way to sum up the mindset, right?
Yeah, it's how the world works.
Well, Richard, with that, I've enjoyed the conversation, mate. I want you to tell us where we can find out more about you. And then for anyone who's perhaps got an itch and wants to learn more, are there any of your books specifically that can give a bit more of an insight to the world of consulting?
Yeah, I mean, I have one specific book called The Management Consultant, Mastering the Art of Delivery. It's a very highly reviewed book. It's available on Amazon. I'm actually working on a second edition, which will come out in about a year's time, just sort of updating it. But that certainly got, if you like, all my thoughts and thinking of almost 30 years experience in consultancy. If people want to know more about me, my business is called Enixus, Enixus, and I've got a website, enixus.co.uk. Otherwise, I have a page on Amazon. I have my sales page with all my books on it, and people can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I write lots of posts and things like that. So any of those routes, and feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to have a conversation.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to all of that in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, Richard, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you particularly for coming on a kind of sales podcast and giving your specific industry insights. That's really valuable for Sales Nation, the 30,000 people that are going to listen to this. So I appreciate that, mate. And I want to thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Will. It's been an absolute pleasure.